Hey, good evening, everybody. It's Friday, the 27th of October at approximately 10:13 Central Standard Time. Just wanted to follow up on what we started on the Wednesday, on Tuesday the 24th. Got to talking about "And You Would Be Queen," and it kind of turned into a rant against the way that people are preaching the Bible, and just wanted to use as an illustration the life of Abraham and Sarah. I think that that way you'll get my point as to what it is that I'm talking about. I know that in this day and age that people don't want to be alone. People want to be with somebody and what have you. But as I said before, what ends up happening is that a lot of times we as preachers will preach to the audience that we have, and because of the fact that the vast majority of the audience are women, we preach to them and tell them that they have the right to be queens and be treated as queens, but yet we don't give them the caveat that the man that they're going to be with, the man that they want to be with, ought to be treated as a king, or given the deference and reverence that God says that he ought to command. So I just wanted to look real briefly at the 17th chapter. Well, starting at the 17th chapter of the book of Genesis, God makes a covenant with Abraham and with Abram, changes his name to Abraham, and then tells him that he's going to have descendants that are as countless as the stars. He also goes on further along in that chapter, and as he's talking, he says also that that every male is to be circumcised as a part of this covenant. And a little bit further down in approximately verse 16 or 17 in chapter 17, God then says that he's going to change Sarai's name to Sarah, and that she is going to be the one that actually bears the heir, that God is going to work out all of his covenantal promises to the children of Israel. And during that time, Abraham laughs into it. The Bible says that Abraham laughs in his heart and says, and because of the fact that Sarah is old, and he doesn't believe really that that as old as she is, that she's going to actually bear a child. So we get a little further along, and then in chapter 18. The Lord comes back with the Lord comes back with the angels, and Abraham then goes into the tent and tells Sarah that she needs to prepare some food. And during that time, this is just before the foretelling of what's going to happen to Sodom and Gomorrah, and where Abraham is talking to God and saying, well, if there's only 50, and Abraham gets all the way down to 10 people. And as to whether or not Sodom and Gomorrah are going to be destroyed. But getting back to the other part of this thing is that very simply, Abraham goes in and tells Sarah, go in there and fix them some food, and to do what they needed. He goes in there and basically tells her that they need to have some food fixed. So Sarah is fixing the food and making sure that the guests are taken care of. And so one of the guests turns to him and says that in the next year that they're going to return, and what's going to happen is that Sarah is going to have a son. Well, Sarah did just like her husband did, and this is a good illustration of, and therefore a man shall leave his mother and father, cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Because in chapter 17, Abraham laughs inside of his heart, and in chapter 18, when Sarah hears the news herself, she starts laughing inside of her heart. But this is where we get back to what we were talking about on Tuesday. Because the thing is that the Bible says, and I'm going to read it directly from chapter 18 of the book of Genesis. Therefore Sarah laughed, chapter 18 verse 12, therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I am waxed old shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also. Now, I want you to take real good note of this, because the thing is that she has already, based on what she has said, she has given deference to her husband. She has said that he is her Lord. The Bible says that we have this hierarchy where God, then the man, then the woman. Today's society says that that thing can be flip-flopped any old kind of way, but that's not what the word says. But I just wanted to bring that up because then, as I said the other day, too many times we spend time talking about what's in the New Testament without going back to the Old Testament and saying, hey, this is what God is actually saying. You have to, and again, I'll repeat what I said before, in order for you to understand what it is that God is talking about, you have to take the messages have to be delivered that actually take the Bible in its entirety. You can't just take stuff out of context without looking at what it says in the Old Testament about a thing, as well as what it says in the New Testament about a thing. And having said that, let me take you to 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3 says, and I'm going to start at verse 5, but actually you ought to read from 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 1, all the way through to the end of verse 7. But verse 5 says, after this manner in the old time, the holy women also who trusted in God adorned themselves, being in subjection unto their own husbands, even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. Remember when we were in Genesis chapter 18, she said, am I to have pleasure from my Lord? Okay, so here we go, calling him Lord, whose daughters ye are, as long as ye do well and are not afraid with any amazement. The thing is that what I'm saying here is that very simply this: when we start talking about, and we're trying to, and believe me, I believe that every woman ought to be treated as a queen. But not only that though, but that thing is, there's a reciprocity that goes along with that. If you want to be treated like a queen, you ought to treat your husband, your man, like a king. That's the only way that this thing works, because the thing is that that's the way that God set this thing up. That's the way it's supposed to work. The world is all jacked up because it's not working the way that God intended it. And bottom line to this whole thing is that if you would be queen, you need to understand that the only place that I know of right now where the queen rules is in England. But any other place, if there is a king, the king is always the one who is first, then the queen. I could take you to the book of Esther, to the beginning of the book of Esther, and we could have a long debate about feminism and what happens when the queen doesn't treat the husband like the king. But that's a whole nother subject for a whole nother time. May God bless and keep you, and good night.